The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to his disciples, "As the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For just as in those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will the coming of the Son of Man be. On that day, 2 people will be working in the field. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding corn together. One will be taken and one will be left. Keep awake, therefore, because you do not know at what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not allow his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour." The Gospel of the Lord. Do any of you know what an Arann sweater looks like?
What?
An Arann sweater? You do? Okay. Never heard of it. Okay. Arann sweaters are these Irish sweaters, thick woolen hand-knitted sweaters with variegated designs on them. Yeah? Still making sense? Still not making sense? Okay. Well, the reason they're not just called Irish sweaters, they're called Arann sweaters, because they come from an area in Ireland, the Arann Islands, 3 little islands off the west coast of County Galway, called the Arann Islands. And these sweaters originated from that place. Now, they're not just beautifully hand-done with very different kinds of designs. If you're a stranger to it and you're seeing one of these for the first time, you have an appreciation of it. It's a very beautiful sweater. It's very warm, very, very heavy, very beautiful as well. But that's when you meet an Arann sweater as a stranger to an Arann sweater. If you are an islander, if you're from the Arann Islands, you appreciate an Arann sweater at a totally different level. Because they're not just articles of clothing, every single family has its unique design. So if you're an islander on the Arann Islands and you see somebody wearing a sweater, you know immediately, oh, this is one of the Keneally boys. Yeah. Oh, this is one of the Murphy lads. Oh, this is one of the Brady bunch. You can tell immediately by looking at the sweater. Every family had crafted its own unique design. And so you could tell, if you were visiting one of the islands, you could tell immediately which family the wearer was from. So that's a second level of appreciation of an Arann sweater. But then there's a third level as well. Originally, it was actually the men who knitted the Arann sweaters, and it was only men who wore them. The people of these islands are basically fishermen and farmers. And since the land is really, really rocky, they're more fishers than farmers. So they're on the ocean on their little currachs, little boats with a skin or stretched over some wood. That's basically what it is. They're great fishermen. And it was the men who knitted these. But over the course of history, for some unknown reason, the women decided they wanted to be the ones doing the knitting. And the guys said, wow, this is easy, great, let them do it. But they didn't realize what the women were up to. And here's what the women were up to. So if one of these guys from one of the islands is wearing a sweater, and he goes to another island, and this is a married man, but he's not wearing a ring, and he sees somebody, a girl, and he's saying, how's it going? Yeah. Do you anything tonight? Yeah. She takes one look at the sweater and she says, get out of it, you're married. He said, how the hell did she know that? And how the hell she knew it was, the women would build special signs into the sweaters to say, this is my man, keep your hands off him. And the guys didn't know that, literally. So not only do they know what family you're from, they know whether you're single or married. And so you've ruined your chances. So the guys thought they wanted a good thing, the women were doing the knitting, and the girls realized they wanted something much better. They were keeping their men safe for themselves. So there's three totally different meanings for the Arann sweater. The first one, as a stranger, you see, well, this is a nice garment. Yeah, well done, great, I like it. The second one is, you're from the islands, and you tell immediately, oh yes, this is one of the Keneally boys. And the third one is, you're one of the women of the island, and you know that this guy is not just a Keneally boy, he's a Keneally man. He's married already. Yeah? Now the scriptures are like that. We meet the scriptures at several different levels. We meet them at a literalist level, where they can be beautiful and appealing to us. And then we meet them at a deeply religious level. And then finally we meet them at a mystical level. So just hold that metaphor for a few moments, because I'm going to give you a second one. The peoples I worked with in Africa, the Kalenjin peoples, they practiced polygamy. And so one man would have 7 or 8 wives. And they were basically nomadic pastoralists. But eventually the government began to forcibly settle them down. But because they'd been pastoralists, they didn't want to live in villages. And so what looked like a village wasn't a village, it was a family. So the father would have his house, and each of the 6 or 7 wives would have their huts. And when boys reached puberty, each of the boys would build his own hut. So what looked like a village of maybe 25 houses was literally a single family. Now, it was a custom among these peoples that when one of the wives got pregnant and was maybe 4 or 5 months advanced in her pregnancy, sexual relationships would cease. And she'd come to term, she'd give birth to her baby, and she'd suckle her child. And then typically when the child was about 2, 2.5, and was walking around, she wanted to give her husband a signal that she was ready to re-engage. And here's what the signal. She would give a little bowl of soup to the 2.5-year-old, and she'd say, bring that across to your daddy's house. And the little kid would trundle across with a bowl of soup. Now, anybody else looking at this, if they didn't know what was happening, would say, oh, there's a little toddler bringing a bowl of soup to his daddy. And think, well, that's a kind of foolish thing. He's going to spill most of it, or the dog is going to lick it en route, or the kid's going to eat it himself. And so I think, it's a nice little thing to do with a kid, showing confidence in him, but it's kind of stupid. But the daddy knew what it meant, and the daddy was real happy. And Mammy knew what it meant, and Mammy was real happy. And so the kid thought he was just bringing soup to his daddy, and everybody else who wasn't a native thought it was just a nice little thing that the mother was trusting a child with a bowl of soup, but daddy knew what it meant, and Mammy knew what it meant. So there again are 3 totally different levels of understanding. And that's what the scriptures are like. There's an apparent meaning, and then there's a cultural meaning, and then there's a deep mystical meaning. Hold that metaphor for a few moments, because there's a third one coming. And this is taken from the scriptures themselves, because even the scriptures themselves evolve in their capacity. Even the heroes within the scriptural stories evolve in their capacity to understand the word of God as it's spoken to them. So there's a great story in Genesis chapter 22 where Abraham is asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he's really wrestling with this. This is the only child he has by his wife Sarah. And now God is asking him to go to Mount Moriah, which is a 3-day trip, and kill the child. And he sets out to do it, and he takes 2 servants with him, and he takes his son, and they take the wood for the sacrifice, and they take the knife to do the killing, and they also have to carry fire. It's very difficult to make fire at that stage. This is 1850 BC. This is almost 4,000 years ago. It was very difficult, so you had to carry fire with you. And they go 2 days into the journey, and finally Abram says to the 2 guys, wait here, I'm going to continue now the last day, just my son and I. And they're trundling along, and this kid is really excited. This is his first trip with his dad. And moreover, daddy has dismissed the 2 servants, and it's just now me and daddy. And the kid is delighted with himself, and he's trundling on with daddy, and he's carrying some of the stuff, and he says, Dad, didn't we forget something? And Dad says, what do you mean? He said, well, we have the wood for the sacrifice, and we got the knife for the sacrifice, and we got the fire for the sacrifice. Where's the sacrifice? We forgot to bring the sheep with us. And Abram says, God himself will provide the sacrifice. And you can imagine the lump in his throat thinking, and it's you. And he gets to the mountaintop, and he straps his son down, puts him on top of the wood, is setting fire to it, and takes out the knife, and he's about to kill the child, and God stays his hand. And he looks around, and there's a ram caught in the bushes. And suddenly you can imagine Abram saying, oi, when I said God himself would provide the sacrifice, I didn't quite realize how true that was. I thought it was my son. Kumbe is not my son, it's nature's son. So he sets his child free, and he kills the ram. Now, if you're a Christian reading this story thousands of years later, you think even Abraham didn't get it, because it wasn't the ram. When Abraham said God himself will provide the sacrifice, he wasn't thinking of substituting a ram for Isaac. He was thinking of sacrificing his own child, Jesus. So now here's a third level of meaning. But that's not even a sufficient level of meaning. If you really want to move into your mysticism, when Abraham said God himself will provide the sacrifice, he was not thinking of Isaac, and he was not thinking of the ram, and he was not thinking just of Jesus. He was thinking of you, because you are the sacrifice. And if we don't get that, we continue to worship a carpenter and to not understand the carpenter's message. Every single one of us is meant to be the sacrifice, because the ego has to die and the self has to diminish in order for the soul to be born. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make 4 main points today. I'm going to treat the scriptural stories that we find in Isaiah and Romans and Matthew today under those kinds of rubrics. And the first thing I want to talk about then is from mystical teachers to institutional leaders. And the second point I'll make is from raw data, all the ways from raw data to spirit on mission. And the third point I will call the myth of the given. And the fourth point I will talk about, so how do I become enlightened? So they're the 4 points I'll make rather quickly this morning. So the first point is this: from mystical teachers to institutional leaders. You take this beautiful reading from Isaiah this morning, Isaiah chapter 2. It was written in 741 BC. We can date this very concisely because of other information given in the same chapter, which collaborates and cross-fertilizes with secular historical stories. This happened in 741 BC. So this is 2,748 years ago. And according to this, the time is upon us, is almost near, when we will beat our swords into plowshares, when peace will break out in our world. And we've been waiting for 2,748 years for this to happen. And the reason this has not yet happened is that we've been looking in the wrong place. The reason this hasn't happened is that we are strangers admiring the Arann sweater. We're not islanders, nor are we women. The reason this has not yet happened is that we're outsiders watching a child bring a bowl of soup to the father's house instead of being the father in the story or the mother in the story. The reason we haven't understood Isaiah is that we haven't understood the book of Genesis. We haven't understood that God himself will provide the sacrifice. We thought it was Isaac, and then we thought it was the ram, and then we thought it was Jesus. That is the reason why peace hasn't happened. Because since the time of Isaiah's prophecy, we have been waiting for God to intervene, to do something dramatic to bring peace in our times. We've been waiting for some cataclysmic event to change human history so we can beat our swords into plowshares. And it hasn't happened. 2,748 years of waiting have resulted in just more conflict and more swords instead of more plowshares. Hasn't happened. So you take the second reading, Paul's letter to the Romans, written about 51 AD. And Paul says, be aware, be ready, because the time is nearer now than when you first believed. Now, Jesus is only dead about 20 years. But Paul is totally convinced that he is about to return imminently. So he says to the Christians, you became Christians 10 years ago. You believed 10 years ago. And I tell you, the day is much nearer now than it was then. So Paul is convinced it's just about to happen. And the people are bracing themselves. And what are they bracing themselves for? They're bracing for themselves for something that 1,956 years later still hasn't happened. Because they're expecting and waiting for the wrong thing. They're expecting a second coming of Jesus, which will be a dramatic cosmic event resulting in some kind of rapture where the good guys are lifted and the bad guys are abandoned. It hasn't happened and it won't happen. And even if the present regime insists on creating an Armageddon in the Middle East in order to force God's hand, it still will not happen, because that is not how it's meant to happen. The second coming of Jesus is not about some kind of a cosmic event that dramatically intervenes in human history. It happens in the silence of the searching soul. So we waited 1,956 years for the second coming to happen, and it hasn't happened. And the third reading, the Gospel of Matthew, and we're going to hear these readings for the next 3 weeks during Advent. And they will sound very dismal, dire, constantly hurting us, making us angry, making us fearful. And it's calculated to do that because it's been taught to us by institutional leaders rather than mystical teachers. It is not about drama, it is not about fear, it is not about anger, it is not about abandonment, it is about something totally different. And so when Jesus says, stay awake, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in, he would stay awake, he wouldn't go to bed, he'd be ready to intervene. So what is Jesus talking about? We have waited for 1,977 years since Jesus proclaimed those words, and it still hasn't happened. He still hasn't come back. So what are we waiting for? We've been waiting for the wrong thing for 2,000 years. Because we've been listening at a surface level. We've been seeing the Arann Sweater as strangers. We've been seeing the little boy with the bowl as anthropologists from outside before we fully understood it. We've been listening to the Genesis 22 story, not realizing that the sacrifice God wants to provide is not Isaac, and it is not the ram, and it is not Jesus, it is you. And when you get that, and when I get that, the second coming has already happened. And so all of the great mystical teachers, they're all telling us the very same thing. It is about waking up to the reality that God is within us and God is among us. Not that God is going to come, not that there's going to be a judgment, not that there's going to be a dramatic intervention, not that there's going to be a cosmic event, but that it's already happened. It happened since before the beginning. It was built in print. But we've been looking in the wrong places constantly. And so you get the great mystical teacher who comes and he arouses that level of passion in people. And the journey starts off and the teacher says, this mystical teacher says, the journey to enlightenment is due north. Let's set out. And the group enthusiastically gathers around the teacher and they set out. And the teacher tells them about, here's what you will encounter. Here will the difficulties be. Here will be the illusions that you'll buy into. Here are the temptations. Do not listen to them. The kingdom of God is en massoi. The kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom of God is already among you. You don't have to wait for it to happen. Don't listen to people who say, oh, there it is, or yeah, there it is. It's within you. You have it already in there if you waken up to it. And we start off in the journey. And then the teacher dies. And then there's consternation. And we're looking around, there's a whole bunch of us who've been following the teacher, and we think, what are we going to do now? And of course, the first thing we do is, we say, let's break up into little groups and discuss it. We break up into little groups and we discuss and we say, well, it seems to me that what we need is some kind of an institution, some kind of organization. And we need a finance committee, definitely, yeah. And we need some kind of a board of elders, some kind of a council of elders, and we probably need one guy to be the leader, and we'll call him the Pope, or whatever. And so we reorganize ourselves, and we still have some of the vision left, but now this new leader takes over and says, well, I've really thought about it and I've prayed deeply about it, and it seems to me that what the teacher really meant was that enlightenment is not actually due north, it's actually northwest. And so we set out and we make a slight little deviation in the plan and we head instead for northwest. And we go on our journey for a while, and then that leader dies and a few more leaders die, and the third or fourth guy down the line says, I had a revelation from God, and where we really need to be heading is not northwest, we need to be going northwest. And so we take a slight deviation, it's only very slight, and we're now going northwest. And we continue on that journey for 50, 60 years, and as new leaders come, every new leader comes and says, I had a vision from God. And God tells me that what the teacher really meant was that we're not supposed to be going northwest, we're supposed to be going west-northwest. And so we make a tiny little shift, we're going west-northwest. And the next guy comes and says, he got it a little bit wrong, he wasn't that far out, but it's not west-northwest, it's actually due west, and so we're now going due west. And then the next guy comes and says, I prayed about this and I meditated, and what I really got was we're still slightly out. So what we really need to be is going west-southwest. And the next guy says then, it's actually southwest. And the next guy says, it's actually south-southwest. And then the final guy says, I got it, it's south. And now we're all going south. We're 180 degrees out. Instead of going north, we're all going south. And we're looking at the very same texts, and we're justifying the fact that in spite of the fact that the teacher said go north, we said what he really meant, of course, was go south, because he was talking in paradox. So when he said love your enemies, the obvious way to love your enemies is to kill them, because they're not good for themselves. And so what he really meant when he said love your enemies, he meant kill them. So we'll have crusades and we'll wipe them out. And when he said, by this will all men know that you're my disciples, if you love each other. But how do you love each other? You root out evil. And so if people are heretics, you burn them at the stake. That's how you love them. That's what he really, really meant. And so you thought he was saying north. He wasn't. He's a teacher. He was talking in paradox. He meant south. And so here we're all now, the whole group of us, going south. And this happens again and again and again in human institutions. We turn mystical teachings into institutional leadership, and north becomes south. This is my first point. Second point then, from raw data to spirit on mission. I've been thinking a lot about this just in the last week. And I've come to the conclusion, I've made some arbitrary decisions and arbitrary definitions, and I've come to the following conclusions. And the first one is this: data are meaningless. Data have no meaning, absolutely no meaning. We assign meaning to data, and then it becomes information. So information is different from data. Data is absolutely meaningless. Until we assign meaning to data, it is meaningless. Once we assign meaning to data, it becomes information. So if I say, there's two little pieces of data. That's one. That's another one. I can make Morse code out of this. A short tap and a long tap. And I can assign a meaning to this. And I can assign a different meaning to that. And if I string them together, I can create complex messages. So that if I string them together, you hear me saying, SOS, Mayday, Mayday, my ship is sinking, come and help me. But the dots themselves, they have absolutely no meaning. The only meaning they have is the assigned meaning. So data are meaningless. Information, however, is data which has been assigned meaning, and then that's very, very different. So we start with data bits which are meaningless. We assign meanings to them, and then they become information. So from what source do we assign meanings? It seems to me we assign meanings from two places. We assign meanings out of our imagination, and we assign meanings out of our memories. And by imagination, when I talk of imagination, imagination is not creating something that didn't exist, bringing into reality that which formerly did not exist. It's not about that. It is bringing into one state of consciousness that which previously existed in a different state of consciousness. And so all imagination and all creativity is literally downloading from a different dimension of this cosmos in which we live. We're not creating ex nihilo. Imagination is not dreaming up something that wasn't there before. It is channeling something from one state of consciousness into another state of consciousness. And when we do that, we then assign some of this to data points, and then it becomes meaningful, then it becomes information. So one source of meaning is our creativity and our imagination. Another source of meaning, I think, is our memory. Our memory banks allow us to put meaning alongside data. And when I talk about memory, I'm talking about two different kinds of memory. I'm talking about genetic memory, and I'm talking about learned memory. So what do I mean by genetic memory? As I was talking about last Sunday, over 4 billion years of evolution on this planet, the basic building code, the basic blueprint for all life is DNA. And so DNA is the memory of the entire trajectory of life on this planet. And so when we take our DNA and you apply it to data bits, the data bits become meaningful. Now, not only is DNA part of our genetic memory, there's a race, or there's a species-specific memory. And so, for instance, our particular bandwidth as we access DNA is slightly different from that of the banana slug, and it's only slightly different. I said to you last week that we share 60% of our DNA with bananas, literally. And we share 80% of our DNA with oak trees, and we share 98.6% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So there's only a small little bandwidth actually which differentiates us. But that little part, the species-specific DNA cluster, that's very important in our memory banks because that allows us to assign memory to things that happen and data bits. And then there's the race memory. Within the human species, there are ethnic groups that have kind of kept themselves together, have had different kinds of experiences as a tribe, and that particular little bandwidth of information becomes very, very important, and that gets to be important in assigning meaning to data bits. And then there's your particular family's DNA, that very tiny, tiny little sliver of the tribal DNA. And this is where how you were raised, and that's very important in how you assign meaning to the data bits and create meaning from them. And then there's your specific DNA itself, what you specifically got from your two parents, that unique little configuration of DNA that's inside you. That's very important in how you assign meaning to the data bits of your experience. And so all these memories are feeding in to how you assign meaning to meaningless data. The second kind of memory is learned memory. Not stuff that's built into the DNA, but stuff that you learn from growing up in a culture, or in a school system, or in a particular family, or from your own particular experiences. These also influence your memory, and they allow you to build in meaning into your data. Now, the DNA memory and the learned memory, they constantly cross-fertilize with each other. Although there's a heresy called Lamarckianism, but actually I believe very strongly in it. I'm totally convinced that cultural experiences work their way into the DNA of a group. So stuff that we learn in one generation, I'm totally convinced, gets actually embedded at some stage into our actual DNA. So there's a cross-fertilization that happens between the two. So we've gone from data bits without meaning to information which is data plus meaning. And the meaning is coming from memory, and memory is of two kinds, genetic and learned memory. And then this memory activates our physiology and our emotion. It co-opts physical responses and emotional reactions to situations, and they reinforce the learning for us. And basically, because this is an instinct, it breaks down to one of three areas. We either move towards something, or we move away from something, or we move against something. So depending on the physiological arousal, or depending on the emotional reaction, we're either going to move towards something that's attractive because we feel love there, or move away from something that we don't like because we're afraid of it, or we move against something because we're angry and full with rage. So basically we have three kinds of emotions, or three kinds of physiological instincts as a result of our memory. Move towards something in love, move away from something in fear, or move against something in rage. And that's how we limber along for the most part. And that gets us in a lot of trouble because it's a very small little repertoire of responses. And so at some stage in the human journey, we developed or we evolved the ability to reason, to think rationally, so that we could override our instincts and think them through. Not just blindly be angry against something, or fearfully run from it, or be attracted to it. We have a whole new repertoire of responses because we can think rationally. Rationality allowed us to create systems, to create consistency, and to create logic to our repertoire of responses. But like all great gifts, they come to be abused. And the gift of reason has been hugely abused in the human trajectory. Every great invention we've turned into an article of war. When we invented fire 800,000 years ago, and we learned how to keep ourselves warm, and we learned how to cook our food, and we learned how to create light from it, and we learned how to protect ourselves against wild animals, that was great. But then we learned how to create guns from it, and intercontinental ballistic missiles from it, and then we turned it into the technology of war. When for the first time we learned to move on water like we saw our amphibian and fish brothers and sisters do, and we invented little canoes and boats, that was great, until we turned them into cruisers and battleships and aircraft carriers, and they become instruments of war. When we finally imitated our winged brothers and sisters and we took to the skies the extraordinary adventure of the freedom of sailing in God's blue heaven, we quickly turned that into bombers. So every technology, every great breakthrough that has been the creation of reason, we've turned into a technology of death. And so at some stage, evolution said, okay, obviously that's not working, let's go a bit further. And so we created the ability to self-reflect. And where reason happens for every child about age 7, self-reflection happens for every child about the age 13. For the first time in our lives, around age 13, we can reflect upon our own actions, our own motives, and the motives and the actions of our tribe and our culture and say, this is not right. And so self-reflection allows us the ability to try to rein in reason which has been hijacked and become a harlot in the service of violence. And self-reflection allows us that peace. But the journey isn't over yet. There are 2 more phases to this evolutionary trajectory. From this trajectory from meaningless data to spirit in action. And the 2 last phases of it are the emergence of soul. Because soul brings a radically new dimension to the equation. Soul brings memory from totally outside the system. All of the other memories are built in. They come from DNA or they come from learned exchanges and experiences. Now, with the emergence of soul, we're able to import memory which is eternal from the time before we incarnated. We are now importing memory of our time in God space. And that's a radical new intervention in the course of human history. But it's not the final one. Because even souls are separate from each other. And even though souls can experience compassion for each other, compassion itself is predicated on the notion of separate identity. And so the final stage of the journey is the full emergence of spirit itself. And the difference between spirit and soul for me is this. Spirit is to soul as Shakespeare is to Hamlet. In other words, Hamlet is just one particular work of the genius called Shakespeare, and soul is just one particular articulation of the infinite Godhead Spirit. So every soul is a bite-sized piece of God, but it's just a bite-sized piece. There are other bite-sized pieces as well. And when we feel compassion for other bite-sized pieces, that is good. That is progress. But it's still not the whole story because it's predicated on separation. That soul is different from this soul. And so with the full unfolding of spirit, we realize there is in fact only God having fun with herself. And then the journey goes full. But it's not a circle. We're not back where you started. It's a spiral. We're back with the same realization, but now we're still being asked to incarnate as human beings. So the mission is not to realize that we are God and to merge totally back into the Godhead. The mission is to take that realization that there is only God, and now to allow God to experience that as Head of Hope, or Joe Owens, or Carmen, or Sean, or anybody else. That's the trick, and that's the mission. And that's when it gets hard again. How do I hold the memory that there is only God experiencing herself as me and you, and at the same time experience myself as me, and allow you to experience yourself as you? Which brings me to my third point. I call it the myth of the given. Part of the difficulty for us human beings is that we believe what our sense data tell us. And so as I look down and I see this bench here, my senses, my eyes tell me it's brown, it's hard, and it's a particular shape. So I attribute color to it, I attribute solidity to it, and I attribute shape to it. And the truth is, I have no idea if that's true. And you say to me, come on, we can all see it's brown, and it's solid, and it's a particular shape. Give us a break here. What I say to you is this: that's because your brain and my brain work the same way. And so what we're agreeing to is a species-wide, arbitrary attribution of characteristics to whatever it is out there. We have no idea what it is. If a snake were to be in the presence of this, it would be registering different sensory information. If a dragonfly were here, it would be different again. If a bat were here, it would be different again. So why do we believe that what we attribute to the data of senses is actually what exists? I said to you that data are meaningless. Sensory data are meaningless. Tactile data are meaningless. Auditory data are meaningless. They're all meaningless until we ascribe meaning to, we attribute and assign meaning to them. And we're doing this as a species, and because our brains are the same and our sensory organs are the same, we now believe that the attributions we've assigned to them actually correspond to what's there. Even though dragonflies tell us different, our snakes tell us different, our bats tell us different. And this in philosophy is called the myth of the given. It's a philosophical fallacy. We have no idea what's out there. Our senses feed us data. The data are meaningless. We attribute particular facets and meaning to it, and then we believe what we find. We're rather like, it's almost like children, you send a child to bed, 5-year-old kid, so it's time to go to 7 o'clock, go to bed. Do I have to? Yes, you have to go to bed at 7 o'clock. And the child goes to his room, closes the door, and he's bored out of his mind. And so he decides to play a game. And he's played this game before, and it's always had the same result. He's going to play the game of, I wonder if there's a monster in the closet. And he tenses himself up, and he goes over to the closet door and he opens it and closes. Ah! Mommy! Mommy! There's a monster in the closet. And he scared himself silly. And he's done this game many times before. And every time it's the same result. But somehow there's a need in him to frighten himself by his own creation. He knows at some level it's not true. He's created it, but somehow there's an excitement about it. But it is so exciting that it grips him and he believes it. Now, there's the myth of the given. We know that this is an illusion, not in the sense that it doesn't exist, but in the sense that it is not the only level of existence. There are many, many higher levels of existence, but in the journey from being a soul to being a soul on safari, or a spirit in a spacesuit, we have to create these little limitations. But the problem is we believe them. We think they're true. The games we make up, we make them up so well, and we play them so often, and we play them so well as a species, that we think they're true, and we believe them. And we create all this fear and all this division. And then we wonder why there's not peace in our times. We wonder why Isaiah could have prophesied it 2,748 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. How Jesus could have prophesied it 1,977 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. How Paul could have prophesied it 1,956 years ago, and it still hasn't happened. Because we're operating on the myth of the given. Which brings me to my final point. So how then do I become enlightened? If you ask a mystic that question, how do I become enlightened? Here's the answer the mystic will give you. The mystic will say, it depends who's asking the question. If it's the ego that's asking the question, the answer is, you can't. Ever. It's not your function. The function of the ego is not to get enlightened. If you got enlightened, it would be for the wrong reasons. Do you think enlightenment would be really cool? People say, wow, there's an enlightened guy. But if you were to get enlightened, you would dissolve. There would be no you. So there'd be nobody to take the credit. That's a downer. So all the credit but no place to put it? That doesn't sound too good. So if you actually did get enlightened, there'd be nobody to take the credit, so it's not going to happen. Moreover, if you did get enlightened, we just have to replace you with somebody who looks like you. Because we need somebody to learn how to tie your shoelaces and pay your taxes, and hang a left at the right place, and eat your food, know where to put it, which orifice the food goes into. We need somebody to do all these things. And you're the guy who does those. So we thank you for what you're doing. But you can't get enlightened. It's not your job to get enlightened. So if the person asking the question is the soul, the mystic will say, well, I have an answer for you as well. When you say to me, then how can I get enlightened? The answer again is, you can't. But for a very different reason. Not because it's not possible, but because it's already happened. Every soul is enlightened. Every soul is a bite-sized piece of God. And so it's supposed to, wow, gee, I feel that's good. So I'm actually enlightened? And the mystic says, yeah, you're actually enlightened. So how come I don't feel enlightened? And the mystic says, well, here's the problem. You do feel enlightened between lifetimes. Because between lifetimes, when you don't have a body, you're bathing in God's presence constantly. So you do feel enlightened. Most of the time you feel enlightened. But every time you agree to incarnation, here's what has to happen. You have to take on a little spacesuit. And you have to take your cosmic intelligence and you've got to shrink it down to a 3-pound brain. And you've got to live inside in this little dense spacesuit. And you've got to create a mind that acts as an interface between soul and ego. And then this mind fools itself like the child playing games in the closet. This mind makes up stories about separate identity and that the world is a very, very tough place and I'm a victim. And it believes them. And as soon as you believe those, you've forgotten who you are. And then you don't feel the enlightenment anymore. The enlightenment is still there, but a cloud has come across. The sun is still up there, beaming, but the cloud has come in the way. And so you're not feeling it. Not because you're not enlightened, but because you've let your mind play tricks with you. And so the poor soul at this stage, okay, so tell me what do I got to do? And the mystic would say at that stage, okay, let me give you 3 simple little hints. The first one is this: appreciate the ego. Thank the ego for the job it is doing. You wouldn't be functional if you didn't have an ego. Thank the ego for what it's doing. But the ego is only the manager of the house. And thank the mind for what it's doing. But the mind is only the tenant in the house. And you have to realize that neither of them is the owner. The ego is the manager of it, and the mind is the tenant of it, but the soul is the owner of it. So you thank both of them for the job they're doing, but you don't allow the ego to act as if it owns the house, and don't believe everything the mind makes up. And then thirdly, trust the unit of experiences, and you've had them. There have been times in your life when you felt oneness, and it has resulted in compassion, and you felt your truest self. Trust that. That is really who you are. Now you've identified the owner of the house. Now you're not mistaking the ego, which is merely the manager, as owner, and you haven't mistaken the mind, which just makes up stories and believes them because it's only the tenant of the house. You've now identified who the owner really is. So 3 very little simple steps. Thank your ego for what it does, but don't let it get beyond itself. Thank your mind for what it does, but don't believe half the rubbish it makes up. And when you feel really expansive, the times in your life when you feel most loving and most compassionate, you've touched your true self.